The Orc princes arrived on the 4th day of the new moon, as the treaty stipulated. There were 7 of them, each one a monument to what 2 centuries of deliberate genetic engineering could produce. They came down the landing ramp of the Terran diplomatic shuttle in order of bloodline rank, their jade-green armor catching the pale yellow light of the Veldra system's twin suns, their tusks filed to ceremonial points and lacquered with the gold paste reserved for formal suit claims. Each one stood between 8 and 10 feet tall. Each one could bench press a hover transport. Their musculature wasn't the grotesque, over-engineered kind you sometimes saw in the outer clans. It was the refined, functional kind of strength that had been bred into the Terran noble houses over 7 generations, tamed by eugenicists, and made beautiful in the way that a weapon made by a master is beautiful. The human delegation watched them come down that ramp, and nobody said anything. Ambassador Alara Vasic stood at the head of the human platform with her hands clasped behind her back and a stillness in her expression that she had spent 30 years cultivating. She was 54. Her hair was silver and cut short. The gray dress uniform of the Human Remnant Council fit her like a second skin, every crease deliberate. Behind her stood 6 aides, a cultural attaché, a medical officer, and 12 remnant guard soldiers in their sand-colored combat armor that looked, frankly, laughable next to the ceremonial magnificence of the Terran princes. She knew that. She'd chosen the sand-colored armor anyway. "High Envoy Vasic," said the foremost prince, the eldest and tallest, whose name was Koravan Tethsal. His basic was perfect. Of course it was. The Terran had spent 100 years learning everything about humanity, systematically and without sentiment. "We are honored to conduct the rite of selection under the Veldris Accords." "You honor us with your presence, Highness," Alara said. The words tasted like protocol. They were protocol. "The council has prepared the selection hall. Princess Sira will receive the princes at the 3rd hour." Koravan inclined his massive head. His orange eyes moved across the human delegation with the slow, evaluative patience of something that had never lost. "And the matter of the prior claim. We were told the council wished to address it before the rite." "Yes," Alara said, "we'll address it in the hall." She turned and walked, and behind her she heard the deep harmonic resonance of 7 enormous beings following her up the steps of the Veldris station, and she did not quicken her pace, and she did not let her jaw clench, and she thought, "Joran, you absolute idiot, you'd better actually show up." The Veldris Accords had been signed 22 years ago, when the human colony fleet, 6 ships, 40,000 people, the last remnant of a species whose homeworld had gone silent under circumstances that no one in the outer systems quite wanted to discuss, had arrived at the edge of Terran space with their drives failing, and their water reclamation systems 2 months from irreparable breakdown. The Terran Grand Council had met them at the border with a choice that wasn't really a choice. Humanity could have the planet Veldris, habitable, temperate, rich with water and arable land. All they needed to do was agree to the cultural integration protocols, trade their technology for shelter, provide medical specialists on request, open their genetic archives. And in 1 generation, when the human children born on Veldris had grown, the Terran noble houses would have the right of suit claim. 1 princess, chosen by the council, offered formally in the right of selection. It had not been a popular agreement. 3 of the 6 ship captains had refused to sign it. 40,000 people in failing ships with 3 weeks of water left had voted, and the vote had not been close, and everyone who voted yes had spent the next 22 years not looking at what they'd agreed to. Sira Vasic had been born on Veldris 11 months after the accords were signed. She was 21 now and Alara's daughter, and she had known her whole life what she was. Not in the cruel way. Alara had never been cruel about it. But she had been honest, which was sometimes worse. "You are the symbol of our survival," Alara had told her once, when Sira was about 12 and had asked with the brutal directness of children why she had to study Terran court etiquette when none of the other kids did. And symbols carry weight. Sira had looked at her mother for a long moment and said, "I don't want to be a symbol." And Alara had said, "I know, I'm sorry." That was all. There wasn't anything else to say. The selection hall had been built specifically for this occasion. The Veldris Council had spent 6 months on it, and the result was something that tried very hard to be neutral and mostly succeeded. The ceiling was high enough to accommodate the Terran princes. The light was warm enough to be flattering to human skin tones. The flowers were a compromised species that neither humans nor Terrans had particular feelings about. Sira stood at the center of it in a dress the color of deep water, and she looked at the 7 princes arranged before her, and she thought, none of them. She was careful not to let that show on her face. She had her mother's discipline, the kind that came from growing up knowing that your face was never just your face. It was always also a political statement. She met each pair of orange eyes in turn. She nodded. She spoke the formal greeting in serviceable High Terran, which she'd been studying since she was 8, and she watched the slight shift of surprise in Coravan's expression that humans were capable of learning his language. Good, let them be surprised. The princes spoke. They made their cases in the formal mode, which was actually quite elegant. The Terran ritual language for suit claim was old, older than their current empire, and it had a gravity to it that transcended the political calculation underneath. Coravan spoke of lineage and the deep rivers of history. The second prince, Veth, spoke of strength. His clan had won 6 border wars in 2 generations. The third and youngest, barely older than Sira herself, a prince named Darrow who had kind eyes that he was clearly embarrassed about, spoke of partnership. Sira listened. She was very good at listening. And then Ambassador Alara Vasek stepped forward from the side of the room, and in her clear, carrying voice said, "The Council must now address the matter of a prior claim. Under Article 14 of the Veldris Accords, an existing formal promise registered before the opening of the rite cannot be superseded by the rite's conclusion without the princess's voluntary consent." The room changed temperature immediately. 7 Terran princes turned their orange eyes to Alara with varying degrees of what Sira recognized as displeasure. "There is no prior claim in the registry," Coravan said, with the patience of someone who has prepared for this objection. "We checked." "The claim was registered this morning," Alara said, "by envoy Joran Kaz, currently inbound from the Rithai system. He is expected within the hour." A very long silence. "An envoy," Coravan said finally. His voice had the careful quality of a man who is choosing not to say what he is thinking. "A human envoy." "Yes." "Claiming formal suit, right over the princess." "Claiming the right of prior promise, which under Terran law as incorporated in the Accords is a recognized pre-rite status." Alara's voice didn't waver by a syllable. "He registered the promise. It must be heard before the rite can conclude." Another silence. Darrow, the youngest prince, glanced at his brothers. Coravan's jaw had set into something that wasn't quite anger yet, but was building toward it the way a storm builds over flatland, a long, slow darkening. "A human man," Coravan said again, very precisely. "Claiming the prior promise on a human woman selected for the right of selection under the Terran Accords." "Yes." "This is," he stopped. He looked at Alara, he looked at Sira. Sira looked back at him with her mother's stillness in her face. "This is an insult." "This is law," Alara said pleasantly. "Your law, incorporated by your Grand Council when they drafted the Accords. We simply chose to use it." Joran Kaz had left Veldris 5 years ago on a diplomatic mission to the Rithai system, which was 11 light-months away at standard drive speeds. He had not, technically, been sent there as an envoy. He had been sent there as a cultural contact, a junior-grade position assigned to 23-year-olds who needed seasoning, and had demonstrated a gift for languages and cross-cultural adaptation. He had been sent there with a small ship, a communication array, a briefcase of data on human history, and no particular expectation that anything significant would happen. The Rithais were a per-contact species. They had long-range radio. They had not yet achieved spaceflight. The mission was observation, and if contact was made, first response protocol. Contact had been made on Joran's second week there. Not by the Rithais, by a clan of Terran traders who had been using the outer Rithais system as an informal dumping ground for contraband, and had been somewhat startled to find a human observation vessel parked in what they considered their space. The resulting diplomatic situation had been complicated, loud, and ultimately resolved through a combination of Joran's genuinely excellent Terran, his willingness to spend 72 hours straight in negotiation, and the fact that he had somehow, in 2 weeks of observation, learned enough about Rithai's culture to broker a deal that benefited all three parties. The Terran traders had been impressed. They had mentioned him in reports that found their way upward through their clan structure to the Grand Council. The Grand Council had offered him an extended commission. Joran had radioed Veldris to ask permission, and Veldris had said yes, and he had spent the next 4.5 years doing exactly the kind of work he was inexplicably good at, threading the gap between species that didn't understand each other, finding the vocabulary that wasn't words, making deals that held. He had also spent those 4.5 years thinking about Sira Vasek, which was a separate matter and not one he discussed with anyone. He had been thinking about her since she was 16, and had walked into a diplomatic training session her mother had dragged her to and sat down next to him, and upon learning that he'd been assigned Terran as a language elective, asked him with genuine curiosity what the Terran word for loneliness was, because she'd been trying to find it for a year, and her dictionaries kept giving her synonyms that weren't quite right. He'd known it. He'd known the word and the 3 shades of meaning it carried, and which shade she'd been looking for without her having to explain it. They had talked for 3 hours. He had thought about her every day since. She had been 16. He had been 22. He had been, accordingly, the soul of propriety, and had said nothing, and had left for Rithais 6 months later, and had spent 4.5 years working very hard and thinking about a girl who was now 21 and apparently about to be given to an alien prince, in a ceremonial selection ritual, that he had registered a formal objection to approximately 3 hours ago on the best legal grounds he could find on short notice. He was aware this was possibly the most absurd thing he had ever done. He was also aware that the alternative was not objecting, and he couldn't do that, so here he was. The ship docked at 14:47 station time, 7 minutes ahead of his estimated arrival, which was because Joran had been pushing the drive harder than recommended for the last 18 hours, and the engine cooling system was now making a sound it hadn't made before. He walked off the dock with a bag slung over his shoulder, and a crease in his jacket from sleeping in it, and 3 days of stubble that he hadn't had time to deal with. The station was Terran-built. Everything in the Veldris system was Terran-built, or Terran-permitted, which was one of those facts about his people's situation that Joran usually kept in a box in his head that he didn't open very often because it made him feel something he didn't have language for in any of the 12 languages he spoke. He had the station layout memorized from the briefing files. The selection hall was on level 4. He had 43 minutes before the right protocol required a ruling on his claim. A young aide intercepted him in the corridor on level 2, breathing hard, which meant she'd been running. Envoy Kaz, Ambassador Vasek's compliments. The princes are assembled. The claim is registered. You need to be in the hall. I know, Joran said. I'm going. What's the temperature in there? The aide blinked. The mood, political temperature. How angry are they? The eldest prince is very contained, the way a storm is contained. And the princess? A pause. The aide looked at him with the careful expression of someone deciding how honest to be. She's been very correct all morning. She hasn't shown anything. She never does, Joran said, mostly to himself. He pushed through the doors to level 3, at a pace that was technically a walk. The selection hall went quiet when he came in. He was not impressive in the way that the Terran princes were impressive. He was medium height, lean in the way that people who spend a lot of time on small ships tend to be lean, not underfed, just efficient, nothing wasted. Dark hair, brown eyes, the kind of unremarkable face that was useful in diplomatic work because it didn't give people a lot to react to before he'd had a chance to speak. He was wearing a human remnant council diplomatic jacket that had seen better days, and carrying a bag that had definitely seen better days, and he had, as noted, not shaved. He walked to the center of the room and stopped, and looked at Sira Vasek, and for one moment forgot to be careful. He had remembered her clearly, he'd thought. He had a good memory, had always had a good memory for the things that mattered, and he'd replayed that 3-hour conversation about Terran vocabulary 100 times in 5 years. But memory was compressed, was a distillation, wasn't the actual thing. The actual thing was standing 12 feet away looking at him with her mother's controlled face, and something happening in her eyes that he recognized from 5 years ago and had been afraid to name then. He made himself breathe. He made himself stop looking at her and look at the princes, which was what the room required. Coravan Tethsal looked at him with the orange eyes of a species that had been genetically engineering itself toward apex predator status for 2 centuries. Joran met those eyes and thought, with the completely calm part of his brain that he'd learned to trust in negotiations. He's not angry. He's contemptuous, which is different. He thinks this is a human embarrassing himself. Good, contempt was easier to work with than anger. Envoy Kaz, Coravan said. The word envoy carried a specific weight in the way he said it, small, deliberately diminished. You've registered a prior promise under Article 14. I have, Joran said. A prior promise requires, Coravan said, with the air of someone reading from a document he'd had time to study, that the promise was made, that it was witnessed, and that the subject of the promise consents to its standing. Do you claim all 3? I claim the first and second, Joran said. The third is for the princess to determine. The orange eyes moved to Sira. Princess, do you acknowledge this claim? And the room waited. Sira had known Joran Kaz was coming for 11 hours, since her mother had told her with the careful lack of expression that meant Alara was trying very hard not to influence a choice that had to be made freely. Her mother had told her, he filed the claim, he's inbound. The law supports it, but it only holds if you say it holds. If you acknowledge it, the princes have to hear his suit before the right can close. If you don't acknowledge it, the right proceeds as scheduled. Sira had said, what does he want? Alara had looked at her for a moment. He wants to try, her mother had said. He wants the right to try. Sira had thought about that for 11 hours. She had thought about it through the formal breakfast and the prince's arrival and the ceremonial greetings and all 7 suit claims, which were well delivered, and which she had listened to carefully and which had not moved her. She had thought about a conversation that had happened 5 years ago, about a Terran word for a kind of loneliness that wasn't quite like any human word for loneliness. A word that meant the specific ache of being surrounded by people who almost understood you. She had been looking for that word for a year before he told it to her. She had known the second he said it that he'd understood what she was looking for without her explaining it. She looked at Coravan. She looked at the other princes. She looked at Darrow, who had kind eyes that he was embarrassed about, and thought, in another world maybe, not this one. She looked at Joran Kaz, who was standing in the middle of this hall in a wrinkled jacket with stubble on his jaw and a bag over his shoulder like he'd just stepped off a 12-hour drive and hadn't had time to be presentable, which was accurate, and whose face was doing the thing she remembered from 5 years ago, completely controlled, but with something in his eyes that was not controlled at all. That was in fact quite entirely uncontrolled, and was looking at her with the focused attention of a person who has been thinking about this moment for a very long time. "Yes," she said clearly into the quiet hall, "I acknowledge the prior promise." The room changed again. This time it was Coravan's jaw that shifted, the same slow tectonic movement she'd noticed before, and Darrow actually looked slightly pleased, which she found she didn't mind. "Then envoy Kaz," Coravan said, with the precision of someone who has been outmaneuvered and is deciding how to feel about it. "You have the floor." Joran put the bag down, which seemed like the right thing to do. He thought about what to say. He had been thinking about what to say for 11 hours, and had come to the conclusion that there was no version of this that was going to sound rational to 7 alien princes, who had flown a diplomatic shuttle 40 light minutes to compete in a formal selection ritual, and were now watching a human man in a wrinkled jacket claim prior right. So he might as well just say what was true. "I met Sira Vasek when I was 22 and she was 16, he said. "We talked for 3 hours about Terran vocabulary. She was looking for a word that meant a specific kind of loneliness, and I knew it, and when I told her she looked at me like—" He stopped and started again, because he was in a diplomatic hall and some things were for public record and some things weren't. "I left Veldris 6 months later. I didn't say anything to her before I left because she was 16 and I was 22 and it wasn't appropriate. I spent 5 years working in the Rethais system." He paused. The princes were watching him with varying degrees of attention. Coravan's expression had shifted from contempt towards something he couldn't read yet. Darrow was looking at him with the kind of attentiveness that a young person gives to a story that interests them. "I came back," Joran said, "because the selection date was in my files, and I have been aware of the right of selection for 5 years. And I spent 5 years telling myself that it was none of my business, that she would make her choice, that it wasn't my place. And then the date came up in my files and I was 11 light months away and I—" Another pause. "I could not come. I tried. I couldn't do it." Coravan said, very precisely, "You are making a romantic claim." "Yes. In a formal diplomatic right of selection, under the Veldris Accords, against 7 Terran princes with legitimate bloodline standing." "Yes." The pause that followed this had texture to it. Joran let it breathe. He'd learned early in diplomatic work that silences had physics, they had weight and momentum, and if you pushed against them too soon, you lost the room. He let the silence do what it was going to do. Coravan looked at him for a long time. The orange eyes were unreadable in the way that all Terran eyes were unreadable when the person behind them was thinking fast. Then slowly something shifted. Not anger, not contempt, something older than both. "You have the right under Article 14 to make your case," Coravan said at last. "The princess will hear it and judge. That is the law." He stepped back. He didn't have to. The right protocol didn't require him to physically step back, but he did it, and his brothers stepped back with him in the formal arrangement of witnesses rather than competitors, and Joran understood suddenly, with the part of him that read rooms for a living, that Coravan Tethsal was a man who respected law even when it inconvenienced him, and that this mattered. He looked at Sira. She was looking at him. The controlled face, her mother's face, the diplomat's face she'd been wearing all morning, it had shifted. Not broken, not discarded. Just adjusted. The way a window adjusts when the light outside changes. She was looking at him with the directness of a person who has decided something and is waiting to see if the world is going to cooperate. He crossed the hall to her and stopped 2 feet away, because the room was still a room and there were still 7 alien princes and an ambassador and 12 soldiers and an assortment of aides watching, and he said, quietly enough that it was just for her, "I should have said something before I left." "Yes," she said, "you should have." "I know. You've been gone 5 years. 11 light months it takes time." You've been back in communication range for 8 months, she said, and he went still because that was correct, and because it meant she had been tracking his position for at least 8 months, and the implications of that were significant. I know, he said. He considered the honest answer. I was working up to it, and then I ran out of time. You almost ran out of time. Almost, he agreed, but not quite. A beat, something in her eyes that wasn't the diplomatic mask and wasn't quite any emotion he could name because he'd never seen her let it show before, and then she said, "The word you told me, 5 years ago, I've used it more than any word in any language. That specific kind of." "I know," he said. "I didn't think anyone would know." "I know," he said for the third time, and this time it meant something different, and she understood what it meant, and the controlled mouth did something complicated at the corner. She turned to Corovan. "Prince Corovan," she said, in her formal voice, the public voice, the one that would go into the record. "Under Article 14 of the Veldris Accords, I exercise the princess's right of primary acknowledgement. I acknowledge the prior promise of Envoy Joran Kaz, and I request that the Council convene the formal hearing before the rite proceeds." The formal hearing was a procedural step that, under Terran law, could take anywhere from 3 days to 6 weeks. Everyone in the room knew this. Corovan looked at her, he looked at Joran. He looked back at Sira. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite the thing she expected. It wasn't outrage or fury. It was something older and stranger, something she might have called respect if she'd been willing to attribute that to him. "The formal hearing," he said carefully, "may take some time." "Yes," Sira said, "it may." Another long silence. Then Corovan turned to his brothers, and a rapid exchange occurred in the rapid-click speech they used among themselves when they didn't want humans to follow, which Sira followed perfectly because she had been studying Terran since she was 8 and the rapid-click dialect since she was 15, and what Corovan said to his brothers was, "The human made a promise and came back for her. 11 light months. He came back for her. Darrow said he looked like a man who could not, and Corovan said yes, and there was a pause, and the eldest prince said something in the old ritual language that Sira recognized from her formal studies. A phrase from the ancient Terran epic of Nexus, the legendary tale of the first bond between worlds. The word that meant a connection that distance cannot dissolve. He turned back. "The Terran delegation," Corovan said formally, "acknowledges the princess's right and will await the convening of the formal hearing. In the interim, we request the hospitality of Veldris Station," which was, in Terran diplomatic language, a concession. Alara's face didn't move. Joran's face didn't move. Sira's face didn't move. They had all learned from the same person. The rest of that day had the quality of aftermath, the particular atmospheric pressure of a thing that has happened and is still settling. The princes were escorted to their quarters. The aides dispersed. Ambassador Vasek had 3 meetings with council members and one very long call with the Terran Grand Council representative that she would describe later as vigorous, which in Alara's vocabulary covered a lot of ground. The selection hall emptied and was reset by the catering staff, who had been very confused about when to bring out the formal dinner. Joran found Sira on the observation deck at the top of Veldris Station as the second sun was going down, which turned the sky outside the viewport a particular shade of gold that didn't exist on Earth. He knew this from old photographs, from his people's archives, the careful documentation of a world they'd lost. It wasn't an Earth color. It was its own color. It belonged here. She was standing at the viewport with her hands at her sides and her shoes off, barefoot on the cold metal floor, and she had taken her hair down from the formal arrangement it had been in all day, and she looked at him when he came in but didn't say anything. He stood next to her and looked at the gold sky. "They'll convene the hearing in 3 days, she said eventually. "I know. It'll take at least 2 weeks, could take longer. I know. and at the end of it the council decides, not me. He turned to look at her. No, Article 14 gives you the primary acknowledgement right. The princess decides, that's the law. She looked at him for a moment. You've been studying the Accords. For 5 years, he said, on and off. Whenever I revisited the subject. 5 years of occasionally researching my legal options. I wasn't sure they were going to be relevant. But you wanted them to be. He looked back at the gold sky. Yes. A pause. The kind of pause that had weight to it. The kind he usually worked with in negotiation rooms. But this was different. This pause was doing something different than diplomatic pauses. It was softer and more dangerous. Joran, she said, the one you told me. He waited. Can you tell it to me again? He looked at her. The gold light was on her face. The gold that wasn't Earth but was theirs now. The gold of this world that 40,000 people had built something from when they had nothing left but each other, and the hard fact of survival. He thought about 5 years of working and traveling, and being very good at his job, and thinking about a 3-hour conversation about vocabulary that had turned out to be the most important 3 hours of his life. He said the word, in High Terran, with all 3 of its shades of meaning, and then he said the full phrase it came from in the original. The nexus that distance cannot dissolve, the connection between 2 people that exists independent of space and time and circumstance, that neither light months nor years, nor the politics of survival can unmake. She was quiet for a moment. I've been using it for 5 years, she said, and I never knew what it felt like from the inside, until right now. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned and looked at him, and this time she let him see it, all of it. The thing she'd been carrying for 5 years with her mother's discipline and her own stubbornness and the hard survival knowledge of a woman who'd been told since childhood that she was a symbol, not a person, and who had never entirely believed it. She let him see that she was a person. She let him see that the person was right here. He thought, this is what I came back for. Not the legal argument, not the Article 14 maneuver, not even the formal hearing. This, just this. The hearing's in 3 days, she said. I know. You should sleep before it, you look terrible. I know that too. I'll brief you on the princes. Coravan is actually not the problem you think he is. He respects the law. Darrow is the one who will ask interesting questions. I noticed that. He looked like he was enjoying it. He's 20. He thinks it's romantic. Is it? She looked at him. The controlled mouth did the complicated thing at the corner again. It's something, she said. I haven't decided what yet. He nodded. He understood that answer. He understood it specifically and without translation, the way you understand a thing that's in your own language, in the language below languages. I'll be here for the hearing, he said, and for whatever comes after. I know, she said. That's the first thing I've been sure of all day. The formal hearing convened on the 3rd day. It lasted 9 days, which was efficient by Terran standards. Joran presented his case in High Terran, without translation, which produced the same slight shock of recalibration in Coravan's expression that it had produced in the selection hall. He presented it not as a romantic argument, but as a legal and philosophical one. The nature of prior promise under Terran jurisprudence, the distinction between the right of selection as a political instrument and the nexus bond as recognized in Terran's own ancient texts, the question of what the Accords were actually designed to protect. He had prepared for this for 5 years. He had thought about it on long drives and in alien meeting rooms and in the small hours when he should have been sleeping. He didn't think of it as romantic. He thought of it as true, which was different and more durable. On the 5th day of the hearing, something unexpected happened. Coravan asked to speak outside of session privately, and Joran met him in a side room with nothing but 2 chairs and the station's filtered air, and the eldest prince sat across from him, and was quiet for a moment in the way of a man deciding how honest to be. "My clan," Corovan said finally in Basic, "has a word for what you did, coming back. The human translations I've been given are all insufficient." Joran waited. "In the old language," Corovan said, "it is the same root as the word for nexus. The bond that distance cannot dissolve. We consider it not romantic. We consider it a matter of nature. Some things are connected and cannot be made unconnected by circumstance." Joran looked at him. "You knew the word from the old language." "It's in our epic texts." A pause. "She knew it too. She'd been looking for it for a year before you told her. Did you know that?" "Yes," Joran said. "She told me." Corovan was quiet for a moment. A human who came 11 light months on a failing drive to make a legal argument in High Terran about the nature of nexus bonds under our own jurisprudence. He looked at Joran steadily. "I don't know what I expected from this process." "It wasn't you." "I'm not what anyone expects," Joran said, which was true in ways that went beyond this particular situation and had been useful to him his entire career. Corovan almost smiled. It was a very small movement, barely perceptible, the kind that Joran wouldn't have caught if he hadn't been specifically watching for it. "No," the prince said. "No, I don't think you are." On the 9th day, the hearing concluded. Sira Vasic stood in the same selection hall where 7 princes had made their cases 8 days earlier, and exercised the right that Article 14 gave her, and acknowledged Joran Ka's prior promise as standing, which under the law meant that the right of selection was suspended pending the resolution of the prior claim, which under the law meant effectively permanently, because the prior claim was hers to resolve, and she had resolved it. Corovan accepted this with the formal grace of a man who had, in 9 days of hearings, arrived at a position he hadn't expected to hold, that the human had made the right argument, that the law was the law, and that there was something in the specific texture of what Joran Kaz had done that he could not find fault with in good conscience even if he wanted to, which he no longer particularly did. Darrow, the youngest prince, with the kind eyes he was embarrassed about, caught Joran's gaze across the room and gave him a brief nod that was not formal and was not required and meant, in the specific body language of young Terran men, something like, "Good. I'm glad it went this way." Joran nodded back. The formal session ended. The Terran delegation prepared to depart. The aides circulated. Ambassador Alara Vasic concluded what she would later describe as a productive series of discussions about the ongoing framework of the Accords, which meant she had spent 9 days turning the procedural crisis into a broader renegotiation of terms that she had, not coincidentally, been wanting to have for several years. Joran found this out afterward and told Sira, who said, "Did you really think she didn't see this coming?" And he said, "I genuinely hadn't considered that angle." And she said, "She is better at this than any of us." And he said, "Yes, I know, I've always known that." And Sira said, "Then maybe you should have called her before you filed the Article 14 claim without telling her first." And Joran said, "I was afraid she'd talk me out of it." And Sira was quiet for a moment and then said, "She wouldn't have." "No," he said. "No." Sira looked at him with the directness she'd been practicing her whole life, the directness that was her own thing, not her mother's, the thing she'd been growing underneath the diplomatic training since she was old enough to know the difference between what she had to do and what she wanted to do. She knew. She's known for years. She just, a pause. She wanted me to choose it, not to be steered into it. "That's," Joran started. "Yes," Sira said, "she's better at this than both of us." He thought about that. He thought about Alara Vasic, 54 years old, silver-haired, 30 years of diplomacy, standing in the selection hall with 7 Terran princes, and not moving a muscle in her face while her daughter's life pivoted around a legal technicality that she had probably identified and flagged years ago, and filed away for exactly this situation. "I should apologize to her," he said. "Probably. She's going to be my mother-in-law." Sira looked at him, the controlled mouth, The thing at the corner that wasn't quite a smile and was going to become one. Is she? If the subject is willing, he said very precisely, and she heard the Terran register in that phrasing, the formal mode, the old language, the root word of nexus. The subject, she said, in the same register, in the language she'd been learning since she was 8 and had been looking for the right word in since she was 16, is willing. Outside, the twin suns of the Veldra system made their gold light on a sky that wasn't Earth's sky, over a world that wasn't Earth's world, on a colony of 40,000 people who had come 11 light months from a system that had gone silent, and who had built something anyway, from nothing, from the specific human stubbornness that finds a foothold in the smallest crack of possible and climbs. The Terran shuttle departed at 17:00. The station resumed its ordinary operations. Alara Vasek held a press briefing that was a masterwork of diplomatic understatement, in which she characterized the preceding 9 days as a productive exercise in cross-cultural jurisprudence, and mentioned, almost incidentally, that the Accords would be undergoing a structural review in which human representatives would have a significantly expanded advisory role. Koravan Tethsal, in the hours between the hearing's conclusion and his shuttle's departure, requested a private meeting with Joran Kaz that no one else was informed of, which Joran reported to Ambassador Vasek afterward, and which she listened to without expression and then said, "I know," and he said, "You know," and she said, "He messaged my office this morning. He wants to establish a direct channel. You're going to need to think about what role you want to play in that." And Joran looked at her for a moment and said, "I just want to stay on Veldris." And Alara looked back at him with the careful assessment of a person who has just decided something, and said, "Yes, I know that, but you're too good at this for that to be all you do." And they both understood that this was the beginning of a different conversation that would take years, and was already underway. Darrow sent a message from the shuttle, a formal phrase in the old Terran, the epic's closing line, the line that ended the story of the first Nexus bond, the one every Terran child learned before they could read anything else. It translated, roughly, to, "The knot that was tied is not undone by wind." Joran read it and showed it to Sira, and she read it and showed it to her mother, and Alara read it and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Keep that one," and they understood she meant the Terran word for it, the word in the root language, the word that meant. Some connections are made at a level below politics and below diplomacy and below law, at the level of the actual structure of the universe, and those are the ones that hold. The gold light moved across the viewport. Joran thought, 11 light months, a failing drive, a wrinkled jacket, a legal argument in someone else's language, and here I am. He thought it was worth every mile. He was, at his core, and in all 12 languages he spoke, a man who knew how to find the right word for a thing. And the right word for this was the one he'd told her 5 years ago, the one she'd been looking for before he said it, the one they had both been carrying since. Nexus, the bond that distance cannot dissolve, the connection that holds. There was a dinner, the night after the hearing concluded. It was not a formal dinner. Alara Vasek had made that decision on the morning of the 9th day, sensing, with the particular instinct of a person who has spent 3 decades reading rooms, that the Terran delegation was at a crossroads of its own, and that food shared without ceremony had a different kind of weight than food shared inside protocol. She had arranged it quietly, in the smaller of the station's dining rooms, with a table that could seat 20 and a menu that the kitchen had spent a week calibrating. Things that were technically Earth-adjacent, the closest approximations available from Veldra's crops and the colony's careful agricultural archives, alongside dishes that were Terran by origin, but had been adapted over 22 years of contact into something that belonged to both cultures and neither. Koravan arrived first, which Alara had expected. He stood at the threshold for one moment, taking in the room, and then entered and sat, and did not say anything about the absence of ceremony, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement. Darrow arrived last, and sat next to Joran, which no one had arranged and which Joran noted without comment. And within 10 minutes they were deep in a conversation about Rithai's phonology that was completely incomprehensible to everyone else at the table and apparently fascinating to both of them. And the youngest Terran prince had produced a small personal device on which he was apparently taking notes. Sira sat across from Joran and watched this happen with an expression that she didn't bother to control, because the diplomatic face was something for diplomatic halls, and this was a dinner. Coravan caught her looking and said, with a deliberateness that indicated he'd chosen the moment, "He studies everything." "I know," she said. "Languages, cultures, legal frameworks, planetary histories." Coravan's orange eyes moved to Joran, who was now apparently asking Darrow something about Terran music theory, which Darrow was answering with the animation of a young man who doesn't often get to talk about the things he actually cares about. He does not stop. "No," Sira said, "he doesn't." "It is," Coravan said carefully, "a trait our culture associates with the strongest bonds, the ones that don't require maintenance. They sustain themselves on curiosity." She looked at the eldest prince. "That's a generous observation." "I am capable of generosity," he said, in a tone that indicated he was aware of how this might sound and had decided to say it anyway. "The right produced an unexpected outcome. That does not mean the outcome is wrong." She held his gaze. Across the table, Joran was explaining something to Darrow that required drawing a rough diagram on a napkin, and Darrow was nodding with the intensity of someone recalibrating a previous assumption. The rest of the princes were spread around the table in various states of genuine engagement with the human aides and cultural attachés, who had been strategically placed among them by Alara, who was currently at the far end of the table, having what appeared to be a relaxed conversation with two of the senior Terran advisors, but was in fact the opening round of the Structural Accords Review, conducted in the register of casual observation. "No," Sira said finally, in answer to Coravan's implied question. "It isn't wrong." The prince inclined his head. The conversation moved on. Later that night, when the dinner had ended and the station had gone to its low-light sleep cycle, and most of the delegation had retired, Sira found Joran in the small archive room on level 2, which contained the colony's records. 40,000 people, their histories and their skills and their memories, all of it catalogued in the careful way of people who know they are the last copy. He was sitting at a reading terminal with his jacket off, reading something she couldn't see at this angle, and he had finally shaved, which changed his face in ways she was still calibrating. "Couldn't sleep," she said. He looked up. "I don't sleep well on stations. The air recycling sounds different." She sat down in the chair across from him. The archive room was quiet and smelled of the specific combination of recycled air and old data storage that was one of the first smells she could remember, because her mother had brought her here when she was small, before she understood what the records were or why they mattered, and she had sat on the floor among the data terminals and played with blocks while Alara worked. "What are you reading?" she asked. He turned the screen to show her. Earth, pre-loss records, specifically a set of audio transcriptions from early xenolinguistic study, the first formal attempts by human scholars to develop frameworks for non-human communication patterns. It was extremely dry reading. "This is what you do when you can't sleep," she said. "I was looking at the section on tonal mapping in non-human phonology," he said. "Darrow mentioned a resonance pattern in the click dialect that I'd misclassified. I wanted to check the original framework." She looked at him. "You're correcting your own classification system at midnight after a 9-day hearing." "The hearing's over. The classification error was bothering me." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the Veldris night had its own particular quality. The absence of Earth's moon meant the darkness was different, fuller, and the stars were closer than they had any right to be, Or at least that was how it had always seemed to her, growing up without a reference point for what the night sky was supposed to look like. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The 5 years when you were in the Rethise system," she looked at the table. "Did you think it would work, the Article 14 claim?" He was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone giving a question the weight it deserves. 40% chance, he said finally, maybe less. The legal argument was solid, but legal arguments only hold if the culture they're made in treats law as binding, and I wasn't certain the Terran Grand Council would defer to their own jurisprudence over political advantage. But Coravan would. I didn't know that, I hoped. He has the bearing of someone who takes the law seriously, you can see it in how he speaks it, but I didn't know. So it was a 40% chance, and you came 11 light months anyway. The alternative, he said carefully, was not coming. She looked at him, and you couldn't do that. No, he met her eyes. I tried. I ran the numbers every other week for 2 years. The odds were never better than 40%, and I could never not come anyway. At some point, I stopped trying to make it rational. That's not very diplomatic of you, she said. No, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. The archive hummed around them, 40,000 lives compressed into storage. Coravan said something to me at dinner, she said, about bonds that sustain themselves on curiosity, that they don't need maintenance. He looked at her steadily. What did you think of that? I thought he was right, she said. I thought he was describing something very specific and he knew it. He's perceptive. He is. For someone who came here to win a selection right and went home having lost it, he's remarkably gracious. He didn't lose anything, Joran said. He came here and found out that the law he wrote into the Accords actually holds. That's a different kind of win. She thought about that. You think he's satisfied with that? I think he's satisfied with knowing that this, Joran gestured between them in a way that was not quite precise but meant exactly what it meant, was real and not manufactured. The right is a political instrument. What he saw in that hall wasn't political. No, she said, it wasn't. Another pause, the stars through the viewport. The Accords review, she said, whatever my mother is negotiating. I heard, more human advisory representation. She said you'd have a role in it, a significant one. He looked at the table. I'm not sure I'm the right person for. You argued Terran jurisprudence in High Terran for 9 days and won, she said. And then you spent the dinner discussing phonology with the youngest prince of a noble house that has historically been uninterested in human cultural output, and by the end of it he was taking notes. She looked at him. You're exactly the right person. You've always been the right person. You've just been 11 light months away. He met her eyes. Something in his face did the thing it had done in the selection hall, the controlled exterior and the other thing underneath it that was not controlled, the thing she had been seeing for 5 years in memory and was now seeing in person, close enough to be sure it was real. I'd like to stay, he said, if there's a place for me here, something that needs doing. I'm not particularly good at staying anywhere that doesn't need what I do. Veldris needs what you do, she said. It's needed it for years. We've been negotiating the Accords with one hand tied behind our backs because we've only had people who know basic and some functional Terran, and you speak 12 languages, and you know the Click dialect better than their own junior attachés. 11, he said. I speak 11, the 12th is still. Joran. He stopped. Stay, she said. He looked at her. The careful man, the one who had been making the rational argument since he arrived, who had measured the odds at 40% and come anyway, who had spent 9 days in a hearing room making his case in someone else's language, and had never once looked rattled. That man looked at her now with no calculation in his face at all, just the simple truth of a person who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey and recognized it as the place they were going. "All right," he said. In the weeks that followed, the pieces of what had happened settled into place with the slow deliberateness of things that were always going to land this way. Ambassador Ilara Vasek completed the preliminary framework of the Accords review. Koravan Tethsal from the Terran homeworld signed the opening document with his personal seal, which was unusual. Typically, a junior diplomatic representative would handle such formalities, and his accompanying note cited the value of direct communication in establishing genuine rather than procedural understanding, which was Terran diplomatic language for something warmer than it appeared. Darrow Tethsal sent Joran a correction to his phonological framework with annotations in 3 languages. Joran sent back a 17-page response. Darrow sent an 18-page counter-response. This correspondence, which was completely outside any official diplomatic channel, continued for years. The colony of Veldris, 40,000 people on a world that wasn't Earth, building something that wasn't Earth but was entirely and ferociously theirs, got on with the business of existing. Water management, crop cycles, the expansion of the Eastern settlement, the ongoing negotiations about technological exchange. The things that were always the actual substance of survival beneath the formal instruments. Joran Kaz was appointed to the Human Remnant Council as a senior cultural liaison, a position that had not existed the week before, which Ilara Vasek created without particular fanfare, and which everyone who had watched 9 days of hearings understood immediately. He was good at it in the specific way of people who are doing the work they were built for, thoroughly, without visible effort, and with the permanent underlying curiosity of someone who finds every problem genuinely interesting. He learned the 12th language. He didn't mention it until 6 months after he'd started, when Sira found the grammar text on his reading terminal and said, "What is this?" And he said, "Rithai's phonological notation, I've been," and she said, "You're learning Rithai's," and he said, "They're a per-contact species, they're going to make contact eventually. Someone should know the language before they arrive," and she looked at him for a long time and then said, "You are the most impractically prepared person I have ever met," and he said, "Is that a criticism?" And she said, "It is absolutely not a criticism." She was building something of her own. It had been forming since she was 12 years old and had been told that she was a symbol, and had decided privately that she was going to be more than that. The Accords Review gave her a structure to build on. She joined the Cultural Exchange Committee, then chaired it, then began designing the youth programs that would be the first true integration of human and Terran educational frameworks, the first generation of children on both sides who would grow up understanding not just the other's language, but the other's structure of thought. She was very good at it, not in the way her mother was good at diplomacy, which was the way of someone who had learned to make peace in crisis conditions. Sira was good at it in the way of someone who had grown up in 2 cultures simultaneously, had been studying the gap between them since she was 8, and had a specific gift for finding the concept that translated across the difference, the word in one language that opened a door into the other. That too ran in families. On the 1-year anniversary of the hearing's conclusion, Koravan Tethsal sent a formal gift to Veldris Station. It was a text, a physical object, which was unusual and significant. The Terran had physical book traditions only for things of genuine cultural weight. It was a hand-copied edition of the Epic of Nexus, the ancient poem from which the root word came, the one about the first bond between worlds, the one every Terran child learned before they could read anything else. The inscription was in the old formal hand, and it was brief, for the ones who knew the word before they knew each other. The knot that was tied is not undone by wind. Joran read it first because Sira was in a meeting, and he happened to be there when it arrived. He sat with it for a while. The text was long, the epic ran to several hundred pages, and he didn't read the whole thing that day. But he read the section he knew, the section he'd quoted in the hearing, and he read Darrow's note that was tucked into the back pages with his usual annotations and corrections, And he thought about 7 princes who had come on a diplomatic shuttle to conduct a formal rite, and had gone home with something different than they'd arrived for. He thought about 40,000 people on a world they hadn't chosen, building something they had. He thought about the specific shape of the thing that had brought him 11 light months on a failing drive in a wrinkled jacket. Not the argument, not the legal framework, not the 40% odds he'd run every 2 weeks for 2 years. The thing underneath all of that. The thing that had no word in Basic, that had the exact right word in Terran, that he had told to a 16-year-old girl who had been looking for it for a year and recognized it instantly. He thought, this is what humans do, not the grand gesture, not the battle won against impossible odds, though those were part of it too. This, the patient-specific work of understanding, the refusal to accept that the gap between minds is unbridgeable, the stubborn absolute certainty that if you can find the right word you can find the way through. That was the HFY beat, not the victory, the stubbornness of the search. Sierra came back from her meeting and found him on the observation deck reading the epic, and she sat down next to him, and he handed her the book, and she read the inscription, and she was quiet for a long time. He could have made this political, she said finally. A formal gift, sent through official channels, timed to the anniversary. It could have been a diplomatic move. It could have, Joran agreed. But it isn't. No. She looked at the inscription again. He understood what happened. He actually understood it. Yes, Joran said, I think so. She was quiet for another moment. Outside the viewport, the twin suns of Veldris were setting, and the sky was going gold again. That specific gold that wasn't Earth's gold, that had nothing to do with Earth's gold, that belonged here, to this sky, to this world, to these 40,000 people who were alive because they had signed an agreement they didn't like, and had spent 22 years building something inside the constraints of it, and who had recently, quietly, begun to reshape those constraints through the patient-specific work of people who knew how to find the right word. Read it to me, she said. He opened the epic to the first page, where the old formal script began, and he read it to her in the original Terran, the language she'd been studying since she was 8, the language whose word for a specific kind of loneliness she'd been searching for since she was 15, the language in which the most important conversation of her life had been conducted. And she listened, and the gold light moved across the viewport, and outside the colony of Veldris went about the ancient, ordinary, extraordinary business of being alive. Nexus, the bond that distance cannot dissolve, the connection that holds,